Hey, Stone Church, this is Pastor Manny. I've got the good man, Pastor Evan, right next to me here, and we are tasked with ending the video series to our Rise and Fall series, where we went through the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and today we're talking about 2 Samuel chapter 21 and 2 Samuel chapter 22, and chapter 22 is a song that David wrote, and it's essentially kind of cool. It's essentially a song that he wrote about, looking back on his life and how awesome God was and how he protected him. And
it's a song of praise.
Song of praise to God, and it's awesome. And it's kind of interesting because it's literally Psalms 18 as well. And they're basically identical with a few minor changes. So we're not going to talk about 22 as much just because it's a song of praise to God that David wrote. But we see in chapter 21 that a lot of stuff is going on. So chapter 21 is actually an epilogue, which is essentially a piece of literary work that concludes, a writing. And there's a lot of events that kind of happen in chapter 21 that are not necessarily in chronological order, but they kind of connect with other stories throughout the book. But in chapter 21, it starts off with talking about a 3-year famine in David's reign that Israel had, and it wasn't until the 3rd year that David finally went to God and was like, "Hey, what happened?"
Yeah.
and God was like, "Well, it's Saul's fault, and because of his bloodthirsty home, he killed off the Gibeonites."
Yeah.
And if you do some more studying, you can kind of see that the Gibeonites were actually part of the Amorites. And God was like, "That's why you've had a famine." And so David was like, "Well, what do I do?" And so what David did was he called up the Gibeonites, had a conversation with them, and said, "Hey, how can I atone for what has happened in the past?" And they were like, "Well, you can hand over 7 of the descendants from Saul to be killed publicly." And so the reason why this was a big deal is, like, in Joshua 9, you can see there was a covenant made between God and Joshua, I believe it was, that Israel wouldn't kill off any of the Gibeonites. And so Saul obviously, disobeyed that covenant. And so now the Gibeonites were like, "Well, David, give us 7 of the descendants of Saul so we can kill them publicly, and that'll be the atonement." And so he did.
Yeah, and it was interesting to think that, like, David's still paying for something that Saul did.
Yeah.
Is
what, and the crazy part is Joshua 9 was about 400 years before this whole thing.
Yeah.
And so it's crazy that, God was expecting these kings of Israel to keep his covenants. And so that kind of starts off with that.
Yeah, and a good thing is, like, what we see here is David replies in a great way. He keeps his promises by bringing 7 people from Saul's line to the Gibeonites, and they do with what they do with them. They end up killing them, which is very sad. But what we see is, like, the promises that were being fulfilled here. And honestly, it just shows us the truth that God always keeps his promises and in time, forever, no matter what the time is, daytime, how far the promises have been made. They will be kept, and it's true in David's story. I know it's true in my life, and I'm sure it's true in your life, how God keeps his promises, and whether that's blessings, whether that's favor, whatever it may be. But when we just seek him and follow him truly, he will keep his promises that he has given us.
Totally, and that's something we can hold on to. That's a truth throughout Scripture that we can hold on to, that God keeps his promises, and we can see that throughout the entire timeline of Scripture. And so, and then throughout the chapter as well, you got that, and you got a few different wars that are said not to be chronologically correct either. But I'm not a historian or a Bible scholar, so this is kind of what I've read from a couple of the commentaries that I've looked into. But another kind of thing that we saw and have been talking about is that God expects us to keep our promises as well. And so when David went to get the 7 descendants of Saul, he spared the life of, was it Jonathan's son?
Just his family line, Jonathan's,
Jonathan's son, and what was his name? His name was
Mephibosheth.
Mephibosheth. Yes. And so that actually stemmed from a promise that he gave to Saul. He gave to Saul?
To Jonathan.
To Jonathan, sorry. He gave to Jonathan a while before that, and he kept his promise. And I think, God honors us keeping our promises as well. Let your yes be yes, let your no be no.
Yeah.
And we could see that true in this story here too.
Yeah, and so something you said to me was like, don't make a promise if you can't make it. Right?
Yeah, if you can't keep it,
if you can't keep it. And so that's something I got to remind myself, of, and to just not promise crazy things.
Yeah, exactly. So at the end of the day, we could read through this and we could pull out so many different things.
Yeah.
But we feel that we can hold on to the truth that God will always keep his promises, and that also God expects us to keep our promises. And so we kind of hold and took out, those two things from the scripture today. We hope that you've enjoyed, these videos that we've been putting out and enjoyed the whole series. God bless you and have a great week.